Thank you. I've got a few things that I've shared with Wallace, including carrying around a butterfly net occasionally. And I took a couple of classes in entomology before, but Wallace has done far more than I ever have. So if you were to travel back in time, and Wallace, this is his bicentenary, he was born in 1823. If you were to travel back in time into the late 1800s, you would find that Wallace's name was easily as recognizable as Charles Darwin's, and for good reason. However, not every day was a good day for Wallace. Here he is, 2/3 of the way back across the Atlantic aboard the cargo ship, the Helen, and the captain enters into his room while Wallace is again suffering from several days of fever and malaise. But Mr. Wallace, I'm afraid the ship's on fire. He has to rush around and collect a few of his items. He grabs his watch, a few coins, and some sketches of palms and fishes in his latest journal, packs them into a little metal case. As they're trying to deal with the fire, they find they can't do anything to stop it, and they lower the two wooden leaky lifeboats into the water. Wallace careens over the side, whistles down along the rope, which strips away a lot of his skin, because he's not feeling so good, goes into two of these wooden lifeboats and has to bail water because it's all taking in water. It takes a couple of days before the water swells and the lifeboats are now fairly water resistant. He indicates in his journal that I began to think that almost all the reward of my 4 years of privation and danger was lost. He sends that in a note off to a friend of his who he had met in the Amazonian forest, Richard Spruce. Fortunately for the crew and Wallace, 10 days later, when they're running very short of water and provisions, another vessel, the Jordison, is able to locate them, and Captain Venables takes Wallace, and Captain Turner shares his cabin room with them. But it's not over, because they encounter some gale force winds and another significant storm. They're battling and billowing water out in the Jordison before they reach safe harbor, 90 days since he left Brazil, back to England. One evening, the captain sits in a chair while Wallace and Turner lay in the bunks, and he's asking him, "Why do you have this axe?" And he says, "In case the ship gets knocked over, I'm going to smash the mast off so we can ride up again." Wallace, through his life, he lived to 90, wrote 22 books and over 700 articles that were published. And I will say here that I owe a debt of gratitude to a lot of libraries and librarians, and Wallace does too. Without public libraries, Wallace would not have become the self-taught scientist that he is and was. He's most noted, at least in science, for the independent discovery of what we refer to as natural selection, along with Charles Darwin, and for founding a lot of biogeography, which is a field that I did my master's work on. He has a lot of influence. He's one of the most recognized scientists until his death in 1913. And how did he do this? He grew up in what we would probably refer to as a lower middle class family. His father was trained as a lawyer, but never practiced in law. His father was really enamored with libraries as well and books, and tried to do some work as a publisher. Failing in that business, he worked in libraries, he did odd jobs. His mother also had to take on some odd jobs. And at the age of 13, he was taken out of his grammar school since the family no longer had any funds for it. At that point, they sent him off to be with his oldest brother, William. So he and John went there and learned the art of surveying. And for quite a few years, in the late 30s and early 40s, Wallace was a surveyor in England and Wales. He thoroughly enjoyed hiking around in the forests and the mountains. And he was astonished to learn that there was a lot of science. He began to botanize here. He went to some public talks in what was referred to as the Hall of Science, and he met Richard Owen, an early person who helped establish the English socialist movement. And from that, he gathered part of the foundation and philosophy of his own life, and he thought that the public really needed more education. And that was one of the foundings for this. His brother helped to have him get down that there was a science called geology, and that all the rocks and some of the fossils out there actually had a bit of study to them. He picked up in the library Charles Lyell's book, or books, The Principles of Geology, one of the founding texts for geology, and that and other works helped him get on the road to thinking about what he wants to do with his life. For a year, he ends up working as an instructor at a school in Leicester, teaching surveying and art. And he doesn't think he's a very good artist, but you'll see that he's not a bad one. He also meets another very important figure in his life, Henry Walter Bates. And Henry Walter Bates tells him that within 10 miles of the radius of Leicester, you can find 1,000 different types of beetles. And Wallace is blown away. Thinks, really? He's been wasting his time on plants? Well, not really, but he starts to go out and eagerly collect along with Bates and share notes and share discussions over books. He becomes one of those beetling enthusiasts, which Charles Darwin had been as well. They read romantic natural history travel accounts, such as Alexander von Humboldt's narratives of the travels in South America, Charles Darwin's on the origin of the voyage of the Beagle, and they start to think that wouldn't it be grand to just go out and explore the world and collect and write about it. On his first overseas trip, not very far away, he goes to Paris and travels for a couple of weeks with his sister, visits some museums, and he writes back to Bates the following in 1847. I begin to feel rather dissatisfied with a mere local collection. Little is to be learned by it. I should like to take some one family to study thoroughly, principally with the view to the theory of the origin of species. This is a pretty revolutionary concept in 1847. But he's not the first. There have been people such as John Baptiste Lamarck in France who came up with potential ideas as to how species changed over time, but nothing's been quite supported. There's a popular account going around called The Vestiges of Natural Creation, written anonymously by a Scotsman, Robert Chambers, who gets the public thinking about this, and it's on the mind of people, and Wallace wants to do it through science. They figure out how can we become collectors? How can we find out about biology and species? Well, we've got to go collect, and we can't do it just here in Leicester or in England. So they work to meet different people. They meet William Edwards, an American who's in England, and he wrote a book called A Voyage Up the Amazon. Edwards was a private collector, and they find out how he did it. He had 11 different contracts from people that he would send insects to, and they purchased it, and it paid for his way. They discuss where they should go from curators at the British Museum, and Doubleday indicates you should go to the northern Amazon. That's fairly unexplored. We don't know what we'll find there. And they receive support from Sir William Hooker, the curator of Kew Gardens, who writes them a letter. From these connections, they're able to meet Samuel Stevens, who ends up being their agent for sales of the specimens that they collect and ship back to him. And here's the Stevens auction house where they would sell this off. Stevens himself is a real entomological enthusiast. He's been a treasurer and a lifelong member. In fact, at one point, he actually saves the Royal Entomological Society from bankruptcy. And he's keen to attract more interest, and he finds in Wallace and Bates a couple of good lads. So they go off. They don't really have any funding. Wallace had saved £100, which is a huge amount, and Bates had a little bit of money too. They go off to Brazil in 1848. They arrive on the east coast, northeast coast in Para, and they begin collecting. At first, they're pretty enamored with the vegetation and their first views of monkeys and a few other things, but they determine that this isn't the best place to go. They've got to head up. So they hire a few hands and they go upriver. And this is their daily schedule for 6 months. In the morning, they're birding, which means they're searching around and shooting the birds. In the afternoon, in the heat of the day, when the insects are most active, they're going around with nets and collecting as many butterflies and beetles as they can, moths in the evening. Then they have to sort of shelter for the daily thunderstorm. Afterwards, they're skinning, pinning, and preparing specimens, eating dinner after that, and noting in their journals, talking with locals. And here's a few things that Wallace noted that locals observed. Oh, the patience of the whites. Does he take all the meat out? No, they're just wasting it. Stuffing this bird. Look, he makes eyes of cotton. And Wallace and Bates both begin to admire the knowledge and information and work that they obtain from locals. And Isadora is one of the people that Wallace notes who's really helpful, not only as a cook, but finding where specimens might be and also collecting a few of them. Their first shipment to Stevens indicates that they've got 1,300 species in total, mostly insects, lots of butterflies, beetles, and a few others. Wallace also collected a number of palms and ferns and ships these off in crates to Sir Joseph Hooker. And some of those specimens, one was a newly discovered palm species, are still noted and curated at the museum in Kew Gardens. After 6 months, they separate, mostly to reduce competition, although there's a lot of biographical questioning as to whether they had some personal conflict too, but no one's ever answered that. But I think it's mostly to just get rid of competition with each other. Bates spends 11 years in the Amazon and in Latin America. He develops concepts that we still use today over animal mimicry. And here's a page notebook from Bates' journal. Imagine the journals that Wallace had that were lost with the Helen. So here's an image of Bates being mobbed by some birds after he's taking one of their own flock. And I think if I was one of those birds, I'd be rather aggressive and angry at Bates as well. Wallace has to contend, as does Bates, with lots of serious issues while he's abroad. In fact, a couple of biographers have noted that it's amazing that Wallace survived these 12 years of exploration, 4 in the Amazon, 8 in the Malay archipelago, when many others did not. But he was frequently ill with fever and had poor rations in food quality in many locations. He would eat whatever was available, which could include ground sloths, tree sloths. That's not why the ground sloths went extinct. Sandflies, wasps, mosquitoes, and these little chigos that he had to peel out under his toenails every night, the eggs of which, so they wouldn't hatch and start burrowing into his skin. And he also found that if he had any exposed skin in several areas, the vampires would have another meal. His youngest brother arrives and spends 2 years, almost 2 years with him collecting, but he decides that collecting is not really for him. He goes back downriver and unfortunately catches yellow fever and dies. And Wallace doesn't even know this for several months. While in bed at another time on his own upriver in the Rio Negro, Wallace is listening to the locals decide what items of his they're going to take as soon as he dies, because that's what they're expecting. He's not going to make it. And he vows that he's never going to go into such wilderness areas completely alone again. Here's a sketch of Potamotrigon wallaceae, a freshwater stingray that only in 2016 was identified as a new species. And here's one of the sketches that Wallace saved when he jumped off the Helen that he made up in the Rio Negro. There's another image of local habits, and as much as he's working in natural history, he's also gaining a lot of cultural anthropology and cross-cultural immersion. He's living, he's working, he's eating with all the locals. He depends upon them, not only for catching a few things, but also for information, for safety. He's far above most 19th century Victorians because of the work he does with so many different cultures, and he loses a lot of his prejudices. He basically is a conglomerate of multiple cultures over his decades. Here's a map. He was a surveyor for many years. He makes a very detailed map of the upper reaches of the Rio Negro where no other European had really been. And this map proves not only useful to him directly, but he's able to publish it, and it is very helpful to him a bit later. He got back into England and he thinks everything's pretty much a bust, but Stevens had actually insured the cargo. And because of that insurance, he gets 200 pounds, which is a fantastic amount. And for over a year, he's able to live in London, attend the zoological and entomological societies, go to the museums, meet with the Royal Geographical Society, and begin planning his next expedition. I don't know how many people here would be shouting that they're ready to go after their ship comes down and they nearly die of thirst 10 days out in the Atlantic, but Wallace is. He also publishes his first two books during this year. One of these is a narrative of travels on the Amazon and Rio Negro, and the other one is palm trees of the Amazon and their uses. Hooker, who reads the palm tree book, of course, finds it rather lacking, and not surprising it was lacking because he lost most of his detailed notes. However, both of these books are considered today to be highlights of the culture and anthropology of, and customs of how people were living then and what they were using for the palm trees, how they worked them out for food, for tools. From the Royal Geographical Society and that map that he published, he's given a little bit of benefit and a sponsorship with a passage to Singapore, which he determines should be his next point to go to. He also hires a young Englishman, 14 years of age, Charles Allen, to attend with him. And here, they end up in Singapore. They go to some of the Makassar Islands, go back, they go over to Borneo, spend quite a long time in Borneo. He meets with Sir James Brooke, known as the White Rajah, who owned and controlled much of northern Borneo at this time. And Brooke is very hospitable, assists with Wallace. He really enjoys Wallace as well. And he also meets, not long after going into Borneo, another man, a young man, possibly 15 years of age, Ali, a Malayan, who becomes his most dependable employee. I'm not going to trace all this out, but in 8 years, he traverses about 16,000 miles across the oceans. The Malay archipelago, which is we would refer to as Indonesia today, is practically the size of the continental US. In 8 years, you can collect a lot, or you and many other people can collect a lot. Practically 126,000 specimens were shipped back to Stevens. Of those, most of these are insects. I think a lot of the insects Wallace did collect, but not all of them. 110,000 insects, over 8,000 birds, a few hundred mammals, some reptiles, and shells. 7,500 shells. Of these, Stevens was able to have only a fraction of those sold to the public museums. The British Museum, now Natural History Museum, has 7% of the insects and 12% of the birds. At the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, just over 4.5% of the insects of Wallace's are there. What about the rest? Wallace set aside several thousands of materials for his own private use, study. Many of these were sold later when his own economic troubles were at hand. A lot of those were purchased by private collectors, such as William Wilson Saunders. And what happened here is that Saunders and many of the other collectors, Saunders' estate financially collapsed, and so did his collection. And along with that collection, unfortunately, also disappeared the context and the origin of those specimens, which pretty much means it's valueless in science. Of the materials that were examined from the private collections or in the museums, thousands of new types were determined. And most of these from but a single taxa, a single specimen. Most of the specimens, we don't know where they are. Yeah. On a good note, I can add that I've done a little bit of assistance here, and I spoke with John Ablett, curator of mollusks, malacology at the Natural History Museum, and I told him when I was there last year that I'd like to look at some of Wallace's shells. And he says, we don't have any. Well, I'd like to look at some of the species, the taxa that Wallace identified or other people identified from his collection, 125. And he says, oh yeah, well, you can do that. So I went and looked with a particular bent at looking at not only the shells, but looking at the localities, of course, where Wallace was or his crew were. And we were able to find them. On the third taxa that I was looking at, I told John that I think Wallace collected these. And then the fourth and the fifth, same. There's a recent publication that from 2015, 12 specimens are known from Wallace of shells in the National Museum of Wales. 5 at the Exeter Museum, and now John, because I didn't have much time there, but he's gone ahead and looked at these. He's found at least 99, I think it's up to 100 different specimens. So we've totaled 116 known Wallace specimens, which is 1.54% of his collected material. There's John, and here's one of the tags that was identified by Pfeiffer. He was a malacologist who looked at and determined the species, taxonomic account of a lot of species of different mollusks. And this one indicated on the tag Isla Botchian, where Wallace was, and it also had Mr. Wallace. It doesn't mean that he wrote that tag, but it was indicated in the collection, probably some private collector that later dispensed this into the museum. The museum had dates as to when it was arriving in the museum. They did not have dates as to when it was collected because that wasn't available. So out of 8 million specimens, it's not too hard to understand why maybe no one else has found anything from Wallace before there. Here's a few of his consignments to Stevens, which lists that 70 small shells. 3 shells from Kay. He was very disappointed that he only got 3 from this site. And from Sarawak, contents included land and marine shells, 160 marine and freshwater shells, from Makassar and more, and from Goram, 238. So he notes a lot of shells, but the details are rather quick and small. More shells, and here in Galilo, he's indicating shells that were collected, but these shells were collected by Allen because Wallace was not there at that particular time. In total, Wallace has a private collection of hundreds of shells, a couple thousand land and marine shells. No one knows the location of any of the marine shells. There's a few more specimens that John located at the museum. And here's the 1865 paper that I first looked at that put me on the the trail to see if I might look at any of Wallace's shells, not knowing that no one knew that they had them. And those are all from Western New Guinea and parts of the Moluccas. Here's a listing of some of the specimens that John was able to locate so far. And then I put together the locations and the dates for those collecting. So now the museum at least knows when they were collected within a few months. Again, from Mysel, Allen was there in Mysel. Wallace never was. And he and his crew of 5 others in an Indonesian prau, a Malayan prau, were really trying to get to Allen and rendezvous and to exchange materials and talk with him. They couldn't do it. The winds and the currents, which were unseasonably atypical, kept pushing them off and pushing them off. They tried to get around here. They lose an anchor and the winds keep pushing them. They can't do anything. They get to this little island here. They anchor off there. They lose another anchor and they only have one left. He's got 2 men that ended up being stranded here. Now they're really running short of water. They almost die of thirst. And they finally get over here. And in 2 days of exploration, Wallace goes up this dried, muddy creek onto the top of the hills and uncovers some water for them. Then they make it over to Waigu and Dabo in New Guinea. And he sends another crew back and they're able to rescue the 2 stranded men. Again, he indicates on another location that he wasn't at, and here's some taxa that we located, or John located at the museum, that Mr. Allen must have got these. And Mr. Allen made a very interesting collection which served to determine the limits of the zoological group of the Celebes. Wallace was all about trying to determine where the geography was for the limitations of these different animals. Wallace's line right here. That's what we call it in biology. This separates the Australian fauna from the Asian fauna. And Wallace wasn't the very first to note this, but he was the very first to detail it across many different islands and many different locations. He noted of those shells that 90 species were limited to a single island, which also was important, that they were just as critical as the birds, the insects, and the mammals in separating out these geographic localities. He wasn't always happy with Allen. And he noted to his sister Fanny, after 12 months constant practice and constant teaching and not the slightest sign of improvement regarding Allen's stuffing of birds and improper positioning of insects. But he does say he collects insects pretty well. There's a local man Dayak crossing a bamboo bridge in Borneo. And here's Ollie. We have one photograph of Ollie that Wallace made when he was about to depart at the end of 8 years with Ollie in Singapore. And he gifted Ollie with his rifles and lots of other things. He was really pleased with Ollie, and he should have been. I think it's estimated by many that Ollie collected perhaps half of the birds that Wallace obtained. So in his Malay archipelago, he indicates going into the interior Borneo that he slept comfortably under a hut with some other Dayak people with half a dozen smoke-dried hung skulls suspended over my head. These were human skulls, of course. And again, he works with all these different people. He understands, gets to know their customs, their politics, their economics, their religions. And I don't think many of us are endeared by the fact that Wallace collected some orangutans, but his collection of 16 orangutans pales in comparison to the 100,000 that have been lost since we've cut down the forests. But he's the first person to write detailed accounts of the habits and behaviors of the orangutans, the first scientific narrative of them. One morning in the hut that he's staying at, he's wondering what's going on. He hears the sound and then he makes out that there's a pretty large snake, a python, above the hut on the thatched roof. He calls Ali and his other employee to look at it, and they run off. And then they gather some more people from the village, and here it's highlighted in probably his greatest work, the Malay archipelago, shows them dispatching this 12-foot python, which is then sent back. And here's the 12-foot python displayed at the Linnean Society Library, where I had the pleasure of working 5 weeks last year. He describes going out and capturing certain insects with delight. And here, upon taking it out of my net and opening the glorious wings of this one, my heart began to beat violently. The blood rushed to my head, and I felt much more like fainting than I had done when in apprehension of immediate death. And he goes on to further describe from the Wallace's golden birdwing butterfly that he suffered from a headache the rest of the day. And this one is Rajah Brooks' butterfly that he named after his friend. Some more notes to Stevens, and he's indicating that, again, Bali and Lombok, though only about 30 miles apart, have completely different zoogeographic regions. That Lombok is the westernmost point for the Australian fauna, and Bali the easternmost point for the Asian forms. And he's sending off, of course, this list of materials, specimens collected to Stevens, and a note that the domestic duck variety is for Mr. Darwin, and so is the jungle cock. He has been pen pals with Charles Darwin because Darwin knows that Wallace is out here. He's had a few papers published, and he's just asking people in different locations if he'd send me certain specimens that he might study. And Wallace obliges. Darwin writes back, of course, every once in a while. He's really good at that. Here's Darwin's house, which is now an English heritage site. One of the subjects on which I have been experimenting and which cost me much trouble is the means of distribution of all organic beings found on oceanic islands. And any facts on this subject would be most gratefully received. And Darwin's also puzzled how land mollusks get to islands, but he experiments and kind of figures out that they might be passengers on birds. Another letter from Darwin, it indicates, because Wallace is wondering what happened with his maybe his second theoretical paper, which is now referred to as the Sarawak Law. And he indicates in that paper, every species has come into existence coincident both in time and space with a pre-existing closely allied species. Noting from his geographic studies that why are all these species so closely related on this island, but not on this island? And why might they be somewhat similar, but not quite the same? And he's starting to put it all together. He doesn't yet have the mechanism, but he's got the data. And Darwin states, I am extremely glad to hear that you are attending to distribution in accordance with theoretical ideas. I am a firm believer that without speculation, there is no good and original observation. So very few naturalists care for anything beyond the mere description of species, but you must not suppose that your paper has not been attended to. Two very good men, Sir Charles Lyell and Mr. Edward Blythe of Calcutta, brought it to my attention. In fact, Lyell was probably alerting Darwin to the fact that you should publish some of these ideas you have. Darwin didn't, he hesitated. One of the huts that Wallace stayed in, Wall Internate in 1858. Wallace, again, is laid down with fever, days of fever, and Ali is attending to him and caring for him. And Wallace is thinking back on all his observations. And then 13 years earlier, he had read Thomas Malthus's argument about how human populations were growing and would have problems because of competition for limited resources and food. And he applies it to all animals. And he writes down, vaguely thinking over the enormous and constant destruction of many individuals, it occurred to me, why do some die and some live? And the answer was clearly that on the whole, the best fitted live. He writes out, after he comes out of his fever, a dozen-page paper and sends it off to Mr. Darwin, who is shocked, stunned, probably floored, and well, it gets Darwin going. Darwin doesn't know what to do. Of course, he asks his friends, Hooker and Lyell, what should I do? I can't publish my work because Wallace sent me this. And they say, well, you know, you have worked on this. And they verified that he had worked on it before. Why don't we do a joint publication? So it becomes known as the Darwin-Wallace theory. Wallace never called it natural selection, but he likes that idea. And here it's presented at the Linnean Society in 1858. Wallace doesn't find out for months, of course, because he's back in the Malay archipelago. And Darwin isn't even attending this presentation because his 2.5-year-old son had just died. But he writes to his mother about how excited it is and how, well, he realizes this has made him, because here he's in league with some of the big names of science in the Victorian world. Now, a little transition. Wallace does pretty good. A few decades later, he's invited to give some presentations on Darwinism, on natural selection from the Lowell Society in Boston. And they say that we'll pay, you know, his finances sometimes are up, sometimes are down, they're never steady. He agrees. He goes in 1886 out to North America, and he spends just under a year there. He lectures on Darwinism and his own perspectives. He observes a lot of America as much as he can. He's enamored with Niagara Falls, but he really wants to see the big trees in California. And he's able to visit his brother John, who he has not seen in 40 years. John went over as a 49er and, of course, failed in gold panning, but did quite well as a surveyor and engineer in California. John organizes some lecture tours for Wallace, and Wallace does go all the way over to California to meet with John. His lectures are a success. There's a lot of people are really interested to see this great man who has developed the theory of natural selection. He's as well known as Darwin at this time. And he's also published a lot of other things that people are quite excited about, including an interest in spiritualism that his sister Fanny kind of set him on to. And he notes that in one lecture on spiritualism, he actually got a crowd of 1,000 people. I don't think he exceeded 200 and some on any Darwinist talk. And he's trying to get money, so he does a few of these. Although his last talk in California on spiritualism, he writes down in his journal that he's quite disappointed. It cost him and his brother $1.50 after renting out the hall, and what income came in was deficient for that rental. He's able to get this other dream of looking at the big trees. He's told his brother he wants to see the big trees. And one day out of San Francisco, going up to Alameda, he rides along with a Dr. Gibbons and a Mr. John Muir to look at the redwoods at 1,500 feet in elevation. And they have lunch inside the redwoods. No one knows what they talked about, but it must have been something, because sometime later, and Muir goes to the Amazon to see the other big trees that Wallace was fascinated with. Wallace does complain about our weather and does not find the 95 to 100 plus degree temperatures that agreeable. He purchases in San Francisco this book a popular California guide to the flora, which he's signed here and dated. This is one of the books of the 300 and some that I examined at the Linnean Society Library, and is annotated by Wallace. And for this, almost all the annotations refer to botanical specimens that he observed, that he found, and he also collected a few of and sent off to his wife and Miss Jekyll. Within the pages, you'll see little notes that simply indicate where he was finding these plants, big trees, and the big trees which are in the Calaveras region, just out of Yosemite. Over in Nevada Falls, and which Yosemite is very fine. In fact, he writes a larger article about it later and indicates that it's one of the greatest valleys he's ever seen in terms of natural beauty. And another note on some small, very pretty flowers among the big trees. In Yosemite, along with his North American journal, he's got some information on some dates when he walks around to Mirror Lake, and notes, again, both in articles in his journal, that it's one of the most beautiful in the world, and the plants that he's locating here. After he leaves his brother and is up in the Sierras at the top, near the Donner Lake and mountain region, he's collecting plants for his wife Mitten and Miss Jekyll, and he's noting all the plants on the dates that he's collecting them. In the libraries, at the Linnean Society, and at the Center for Research Collections at the University of Edinburgh, there's these little embossed stamps that indicate where his personal library came from. It came from a Thomas Henry Riches, who in 1915 donated all these to the libraries. And there's about 360 books of Wallace's, some of them multi-volume encyclopedias, that the Linnean Society has, and there's close to 400 books at the Edinburgh Library. So I looked through a few of these, 350 or so far, and there's the hotel he stayed at when he was in Calaveras and hiked around looking at the trees. He would measure the trees, the girth, the height, estimate them, and just be stunned at the magnificence of these trees. Some days he walked 12 miles to do this. He notes, of all the natural wonders I saw in America, nothing impressed me so much as these glorious trees. The huge decayed trunk called Father of the Forest, which has fallen perhaps a century or more, exhibits the grandest dimensions of any known tree. By measuring its remains and allowing for the probable thickness of the bark, it seems to have been around 35 feet in diameter. He's always adding up a couple feet for the bark that's missing. At 90 feet up, 15 feet, and even at a height of 270 feet, it was 9 feet in diameter. It was in all probability more than 400 feet in height, which may or may not be a big tree story, because we don't know of any tree of this height, although historically it's possible. There may be. Unfortunately, these alone are within the power of man totally to destroy, as they have been already partially destroyed. A final note from Wallace. Let us hope that the progress of true education will so develop the love and admiration of nature, that the possession of these altogether unequaled trees will be looked upon as a trust for all future generations. And that care will be taken before it is too late to preserve not only one or two small patches, but some more extensive tracts of forest in which they may continue to flourish and in their fullest perfection and beauty. So thanks to libraries and librarians, thanks to Yavapai College, thanks to my friend Robert, who did a little bit of reading, some encyclopedias for me, and John Ablett. Questions?
Yeah, I have one for you.
So how much of what Wallace did over in Malay you think really got Darwin to finally publish in 1859, I believe? Because I think he had a
Yeah.
date up there of 1858 when that letter was sent.
1858 is when the joint theory of natural selection got published for the Darwin-Wallace theory. And it was known as the Darwin-Wallace theory until the early 1900s, after Wallace passed away. And then when it got resurrected, as pretty much people think of Charles Darwin and natural selection, it was probably, it had his name tied to it more than anyone else, and because he wrote the big book, The Origin of Species, which was actually a sort of a Reader's Digest version of what Darwin wanted to write. It was 450 pages instead of 1,000 pages that Darwin was thinking of putting out, and he would never have put out this very popular book that was widely read by the public if it wasn't for Wallace, because he was going to put out, possibly after he died, a huge tome that a few naturalists would have read and philosophers might have discussed, but nothing like what he wrote that any educated person could and many did read. So that was very important for the history of what we think of in terms of Charles Darwin. And then when natural selection got resurrected a lot in the neo-Darwinian movement of the 1920s to 1950s by mostly geneticists, where they started to tie in population genetics along with evolutionary mechanisms. It was Darwin's name that was carried forward, and I guess they didn't read Wallace much. So that's kind of what happened. However, if you read about Sherlock Holmes or the Lost World of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, some of the characters there are based upon Wallace. The Malay Archipelago was a book that he indicated he frequently kept at his bedside and read and reread and reread. And if you ever watched Indiana Jones, that character was based loosely on Wallace. Wallace was a lot tougher than Indiana, though, and much more modest.
I'm a former librarian, so thank you for the homage to librarians. And I was wondering, what was it that with the shells that turned you on to think, well, these were collected by Wallace? I didn't
just
quite
because
understand.
I was looking at very specific dates and localities, and they didn't have those there, but they had the localities. So the particular localities matching with the 1865 paper that indicated these are taxa that Wallace had collected from the Malay Archipelago, 125 taxa, some of which have been reclassified since then. And I thought, I'd just like to see some of these, and I didn't know that no one had searched much before, but yeah, no one had. So I knew that the insects, the birds, and the mammals had been well looked over from Wallace's collections, but not the shells.
And what finally killed him with all the things
Wallace,
he's gone through? Yes, Wallace, how did he finally die?
90 years old age. He did quite well. And in fact, bringing it back to Arizona, Wallace wrote a critique of Percival Lowell's canals on Mars. He admired Lowell's observations to a degree, but he disagreed strongly with Lowell's conclusions that Mars was inhabited by intelligent beings.
You had mentioned Bates earlier in your presentation. Is that the same Bates that does the Batesian models with the mutations?
Yeah, that's the origin of those. Yeah. Bates also published a few books and works, and he has an extensive collection, which I'm going to be there for a couple of weeks this summer. I might take a look at the Oxford University Museum.
What do you think happened to all of the specimens, the 100,000 plus specimens? Do you think they've just been thrown away?
I think many of them have been thrown away. Specimens do go moldy. They get rot, and then other people just aren't interested. It's in some family estate possession, then it gets either sold or given to other family members, and they're not as interested as the person who collected them. And then there's no notes, and they just go, oh, it's kind of pretty, we'll put it on a shelf. Or I'll bet in 100+ different houses across the UK, there's thousands of specimens that no one knows where they came from. Yeah, yeah. A Wallace roadshow trip, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bevers, for presenting your research. Really interesting. I was curious about, at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that Wallace examined botany through the lens of cultural use. I was wondering if that was unique for the time, or were other botanists doing that as well?
I don't think anyone else, some other botanists were doing this, because a lot of people from the Western world were going over to Asia, to South America, to Africa, and they were examining the uses of plants. And then they would find out that, oh, this one's really good for agriculture. This one might be good for certain products. Maybe this one's good for some medical uses. So they would import them, but I don't think they studied them quite as intimately as Wallace had. I know that a few of his friends had Thomas Huxley, had lived for several months with some Aborigines in northern Queensland, and he got also down some cultural anthropological perspectives and uses and customs, religious observations of the people there. And so he wrote about these. But of the well-known naturalists, not that many were living day to day, oftentimes with almost nothing, and having to survive off the assistance of everyone around them. Darwin and Hooker, they were on board naval vessels and well cared for generally. Sometimes they had certain privations, but or what Bates endured. Bates did not come through this with the same positive opinion of all of the local people. And Wallace had varying opinions of different cultures that he encountered, but generally he was quite favorable to almost all of these people that he had met. And he wrote in his journals and in the Malay archipelago several times how he was assisted by some of these people. One example is Ali, who I mentioned, is now thought to have collected half of the 8,000 birds that Wallace sent to Stevens. One day he comes over and he says, Mr. Wallace, see what I've got, a very strange looking bird. It is Wallace's standard wing bird of paradise. It is a brand new bird of paradise, which Wallace immediately recognized after examining it, that it was not any of the other described birds of paradise. Wallace also was among the first Europeans ever to observe the birds of paradise in the wild and write down articles and descriptions of what they were doing. He wrote about the lucking behavior of many males dancing around for the females, which unfortunately for the birds was very helpful for him and his collectors, because here's a group of male birds that you can grab and sell. And everything was about finances. You have to support this expedition, and he didn't have any other way of doing it. But yeah, he was really entwined with local culture, and a lot of his works are now recognized as being historically important anthropological views and perspectives.
Any other questions? Please help me in thanking Dr. Bevers for his presentation today.